Thank you for joining us as we continue our study on the Sermon on the Mount. This has been such a great study. Sean has done such a great job of opening it up, and I'll be teaching this week, and then he'll teach again next week. But this has just been a really good study, personally challenging to teach and to prepare material for. And Sean has done such a good job getting us going, and he actually even created a website for us to utilize. As far as if you've missed some of the previous lessons on any of our online classes that we've been doing, that you can go to, and it's jabiblestudy.com. And so you can go there and kind of watch some of our videos in the order that they take place. I know sometimes navigating Facebook and trying to find previous ones is difficult. So Sean has made a website available for that. And so in connection with this class, we do a Zoom discussion. So you can watch this video, and then on Wednesdays at 6:30, you join us via Zoom. Because we just can't cover everything. In fact, I try to do three verses, and it took me like 50 minutes to cover three. And so I just whittled it down to doing one verse for this class. And so the Zoom gives us an opportunity to go further into material, gives us a chance to discuss things. And so that's a great opportunity to continue studying in that fashion. And we hope that you join us for that. As we do a quick recap of the context in which this Sermon on the Mount takes place, because it's really important with what we're going to be covering today. The land of that Jesus was in, doing his ministry, teaching at this time, it was filled with many problems. It had a strong military government, which meant it was filled with some absolute rulers, kind of like the opposite of a democracy and how they rule things. And so it was a strong world of persecution, meaning there was multiple people who had limited rights to elevate the status of a few, and taxes consumed a large portion of their income. Rome was an empire that was funded by its conquest and funded by its people to maintain its status and dominance in the world. Racial prejudice was strong, not just in the world, but even among the Jews and the people that Jesus was talking to, so much so he had to explain who their neighbor was at one point. Slavery was rampant. There was one report that said that there were approximately 3 slaves to every free man. And so, we think about the world that Jesus was in, and for Jews or non-Jews, unless you were in a position of power, it was a tough world to live in. And so the response by the Jews, we kind of broke it down into sects, and David Padfield did a good job of breaking these down. And so I'm borrowing this from him. But he broke them down between the Zealots, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. And, the Zealots were kind of like the military focus group of the day of the Jews. Like I guess Rome would consider them terrorists. Don't worry about your spiritual life. Our hope is military might. That was kind of their motto. The Sadducees were more of like, we can survive by compromising with Rome. So we can be cautious and we'll negotiate the best bargain we can. So we just have to compromise our values a little. And then the Pharisees said that let's leave a clean, ritually pure life, meaning let's follow all these laws that God gave us, but also all these other laws and traditions that man has developed. And then we're going to put a hedge around the Torah, and that's going to be our focus. And so one of the things that he said I thought was interesting, it's been said that the Sadducees bargained with Rome, but the Pharisees bargained with God. And so Jesus is sharing the Beatitudes that we've been looking at in this Sermon on the Mount with a group of people who are in a tough spot in the world that they're living in. But also he's teaching them a group of people whose religious leaders were struggling. They were struggling with either maintaining their connection with God in order to maintain a cushy life, or the Pharisees were struggling with all these laws and this legalistic mindset that they had. And so Jesus came in at the right time to deliver a message to people who needed it. And so we've been talking about what the word blessed means, and Sean did a great job. So go back and watch some of the previous videos if you didn't see those, because he does a way more in-depth job than what I'm covering this morning. And so, we talked about blessed and what it means when he says, blessed are, and blessed means happy. That's the word, how it's translated. Now, the Jews would understand what happy meant, not in the context of how we interpret happy today. Ours is, kind of a lighter based happy that's based on our circumstances, I guess. But this was almost like a joy, inner joy fulfilled by God that made one complete. There was just like it wasn't based on necessarily on their physical circumstance, but it was more on like their spiritual position with God, and where that was at. And so it meant like, you were getting the promises of God were being met in your life. I don't know if hopefully that makes sense. And so don't think of when we're reading them and we think about happy are these, like it really should redefine what happiness is for us, and what it was meant to be, maybe more so than what it is now. So let's dig in with our verse that we're going to be covering this morning. It says, or today, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. In this world, people hunger and thirst after something. It can be a variety of things. In the Bible, we see examples of what people hungered and thirst for. The rich fool, he hungered for a life of ease. In Luke 12, he's had a really good crop. And so instead of, not just profiting normally from that, and then, helping those around him, he decides he's going to lay up and have a life of ease for the rest of his life. He got what he wanted, and it turned out to be utter failure in that regard. King Nebuchadnezzar hungered after the praise of men, looking at the how wonderful a kingdom that he created with his own hands, and God humbled him after that. And Demas, we read in Timothy, he hungered after this present world. And that last one is probably what most of us get trapped up into. We hunger and thirst, not necessarily for the righteousness of God that He can bestow, but we have a hunger within us to be filled, and so we find the things in this world that we feel like fill it best, and we just try to stay attached to those. Now, they don't completely satisfy us in any way, but they fill us for that, maybe for that moment, or they fill us up halfway. And so we can understand the Beatitudes and what we're going to be talking about this morning if we understand the prevailing standards in the days of the Lord of what righteousness meant among the Jews. And for the Jews, when it talks about blessed those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, that meant for the Jews that meant I'm going to hunger and thirst to fulfill exterior expressions of this law of outer holiness. So their righteousness was measured by their outward expression and their displays, not really upon their inner holiness, not really on their relationship with God. It was more on their ability to carry out not just His word and law, but mainly it was focused on their ability to fill out, to do these traditions that had been created over generations in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So these Jews had set up their system of justification, and they were kind of ignorant of the gospel plan of how God forgives sinners. And so they had kind of created a system where they were going to be justified in their sin by what they did. And as we've been talking about the Beatitudes, we recognize that these aren't things that God is calling for us to do. This is not a to-do list. This is a to-be list. This is calling us to be a person who hungers and thirsts for righteousness, not somebody who just does it like one time. It's not just something that you can check off your list like, okay, I hungered and thirst for righteousness today. No, this is who we are as a person who is hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And we're going to talk about what righteousness means. The Jews, their idea of what it was kind of what we've been talking about, this system of justification by a strict adherence to laws they created. But it's more than, uh, following laws, because we're going to study here in just a minute that, the laws, following the law doesn't make you spiritually clean. I will say that in God's eyes. Um, well, we're going backwards. There we go. And I love, so I'm going to be using a few quotes from different studies that we've looked at, and so to get a better grasp of context of what Jesus is dealing with here, Jordan had a great quote in his study in the Sermon on the Mount, and here it is. It says, "The religious life of the people had become pretty much centered within the temple and the synagogue. It was measured in terms of attendance, contribution, and obedience to the myriad of rules, precepts, traditions, and laws handed down and added to by generations of priests." Think about that. And he said that. My first thought, honestly, was like, man, I bet that's probably the mindset of people today. A lot of times, we get wrapped up thinking a religious life today is somebody who attends church, they make contributions, and they try to obey different commandments in the Bible. Or they try to obey some of the traditions that we've set up, even in America, of what Christianity looks like after years and years. And so, you think about that, like it's really easy to fall into the same pattern of what the Pharisees had set up, what religious life looks like, what righteousness looks like. And so he goes on to say that their righteousness was something like perfume. It wasn't part of you, but you had it on and it made you smell really sweet. Of course, everybody recognized the odor, but that didn't matter because they used it too. And man, he just, just like Jesus continually addresses the righteousness of the Pharisees, like John the Baptist did, like there was a problem with how they viewed their relationship with God. They felt like they had earned a state with God of righteousness, and that if they obeyed all these things, and they put on righteousness on their own. Um, and so they felt like, "Well, we're just going to do a checklist, and that's going to give us our righteousness." And I love, he kind of compares it to something that we can recognize. Like it was like a perfume. Like it wasn't really who they were, but they smelled like it. And so for those who were seeking something, the Pharisees, who just smelled like righteousness, was what they had as an example. And so that was a really destitute spiritual, I guess, land to grow up in, as far as an example of looking for something to follow. So Jesus came on the scene, and he is, uh, sharing a message of a totally different kingdom to be a part of, and that requires a totally different you. This righteousness is not something that you can physically obtain. It's something that is divinely given. And so it's just an amazing thing that he's drawn our minds, even today, back to this dangerous mindset of like, hey, it's possible for you to smell like righteousness, but not be righteous. It's a temptation, just like the Pharisees, to think that attendance, contribution, and obedience to these laws is like, or traditions, is what's the most important thing. And so, this is a good reminder. Um, let's see. I'm sorry that this thing keeps going. Let's talk about righteousness a little bit. Many times, if you look in your concordance, you might even see sometimes it stands for justification. It might have like a little link there. It does, even in Paul's letter to the Romans, if you're studying that, there's occasions where it might be uh, linked to justification. And we're going to talk about what that means. And so for the Jews of the day, as we just discussed, it was something they obtained themselves. But we know righteousness is not something that we obtain. It's something that God grants. There's a justification of, well, here, I'll look at the screen and just go with that. It's to be right with God. That's how I always have heard justification described is, you're in a state where you are right with God, not because of what you did, but because of what he's done for you so that you could be right with God. It's a state of justification due to forgiveness of sin. So righteousness, if you're, I guess, think about what righteousness is. It's somebody who's in a state of rightness with God because God has forgiven them of their sins and they are living a life devoted to Him. So it's not something that you can just live and gain. It's something that's given and lived in on our part. And so it encompasses both the desire to be free from sin in all its forms and the desire to walk with God in perfect, sweet communion. It's kind of like a desire that's there and and a heart that's dedicated towards walking in that desire. That's what we're talking about. Hungry, thirsting for righteousness is that hunger and thirst to desire this righteousness that God can give us and to walk in it so that we can be with Him. Romans 1:16-17, it simply states that the gospel reveals how God forgives sinners and thus makes sinners righteous. And so our trouble today is the same trouble in the times of Jesus. It's not that when there's one particular sin that's there, um, but it's sin itself is the problem. And so Jesus is not trying to like focus, and he's going to focus later on in the sermon on maybe just different sins or different issues of the day. But he is trying to make them aware that righteousness, seeking God, is a focus that we should have. And it's not necessarily on just trying to avoid one sin, but it's trying to rid yourself of sin itself. It's trying to be as pure, on in your relationship with God as much as it involves uh, your effort. And so I'm trying to make sure I'm not saying like this is something that you earn or do like the Pharisees, but there is an aspect of like God declares us righteousness due he declares us righteous due to the forgiveness of our sins. But that encompasses afterwards that ability for us to desire to remain free from sin and to walk with God in sweet communion, and what that means for us. And so um, I think this switched back again. Let's see. So in hunger and thirst, when he uses those words in this, and I wanted to kind of cover what righteousness meant, so that we knew what hunger and thirst, how it really connected with this. But hunger and thirst, they're frequent human urges. How immensely satisfied it is to eat a meal when you're starving or to get a drink of water when you're thirsty. We may struggle, I think, to connect with what that's like on a daily basis. But those who heard this when Jesus was preaching, they knew the desires intimately. The world that he was in, like there were no like massive amounts of grocery stores and food supplies that you could go and were affordable to buy food and stuff. And so there wasn't somebody who had all their meals laid out for a lot of times for the people that were hearing Jesus this time. It wasn't that there was just like a steady supply. A lot of these people experienced hunger and thirst, especially if they traveled a lot on a daily basis. And the Bible often uses hunger and thirst to exemplify powerful desires. Um, there's Isaiah 55:1-2 says, "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you have no money, come buy and eat. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what is that not satisfied? Listen to me, eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest fare." People who come to Christ, I like how this person wrote this. It says, people who come to Christ in penitent faith realize that they don't have what it takes before God, and so they hunger and thirst to be made right in their relationship with God. That's what they desire. So when we think about blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, we're saying blessed are the people who are aware of their relationship with God and its shortcomings, and they hunger and they thirst and they starve after it, like it's the only thing that is going to satisfy them, like it's the only thing that matters, is to have that relationship with God again, to be righteous again, so that they can have that sweet communion with God. That's supposed to be us. We're supposed to have such a strong adherence to sin and what it is, that we are just pursuing and hunger and thirsting after a relationship with God. Uh, and I try to think about sometimes, is that you? Like, is that me? Is that who I am? I'm a person who continually is starving after having a right relationship with God. And so, this is a great chance to evaluate that. Man, again, it's going all the way back and then going forward. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Sorry about that. If you know it's me and technology, it's always a battle. And so, there should be a desire within us, a desire that's not met. We talked at the beginning, like there's different people in the Bible who tried to be filled with things of this world. And we should be having desires. We should have a desire that this world just is not meeting. C.S. Lewis said it this way: if I find myself a desire which no experience of this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. We are made to be in God's presence. We are made for the garden. We were made for having a relationship with Him in heaven for all eternity. So there's going to be things that we desire that only He can fulfill, only God can meet. But in order uh, to even get to that point, I guess in order to even be filled, we've got to have a desire for it. We got to have a hunger and thirst for it. And I think that's the first qualification when we think about this Beatitudes. It's calling for a people who are hunger and thirsting for God. So many times we think about our relationship. That's kind of what we've been focusing on, is our relationship with God. When we think about when we're trying to share the gospel with people, we can't shoot. Pat Field said this, I thought was really good. You can't shoot the gospel into a man, nor machine gun Christianity into him. He must know what the gospel offers and realize his own condition without it. That's true for the people we're trying to reach out to. We can do so much for them, but we can't force the gospel into them. They've got to desire it. And we've got people that even come to church, regularly, who are tasting a little bit of God, but haven't really wanted to hunger and thirst for the fullness of what He can offer. And we can't force that on them. There's so many people in our lives that we may be thinking about that we would love to come to God and have a relationship with them, but they're just not at that point where they desire it. Or maybe there's people who've fallen away, and so if you want something to pray for, pray that they become a person. Pray for their heart to be open to now hunger and thirst for righteousness, because then they're going to seek after it and desire it in a way. And that kind of goes with what I've got on the screen. They're going to be one who so deeply desires this justification that they're going to meet the conditions necessary to obtain it. They're going to hunger and thirst so much for what God has to offer and restoring their relationship with Him. They're going to do what is necessary. It's kind of like you think about just me and Hazel just read the story of Naaman, I think, in the Old Testament this week. And we were talking about how, like, here's this condition. He could be cleansed of leprosy or this disease if he just goes and does what Elisha says and bathes in the Jordan. And he has such a hard time with that. But when he realizes what it means, like, okay, I can be cleansed of this. Okay, whatever he says, it's worth doing. Why wouldn't I do it? Um, I think that's kind of where we get to that heart point of us when we desire that purification, when we desire that justification, when we desire this righteousness, then we're going to do everything on our part, all the conditions that we can complete to obtain that. The sons of Korah cried out this way: as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. We need to be asking ourselves, is that me? Am I paying for it? Am I living in such a way that I am hunger and thirsting for God? And here we go. Let's get the. Uh, oh, there we go. as a proof of this, Chappell had this really great thing to say about even like Christians today and our struggle with hunger and thirst and just maybe the absence that we have or the struggle that we have with it. And I'll read that. It says, as a proof of this, consider the vast number of people who frankly have no taste for the spiritual. The most inspiring service ever held would scarcely awaken their interest. The best sermon ever preached would bore them. The very thought of worship is repellent. The Bible throbbing with thoughts that breathe and words that burn is to them the deadest of dead books. The great hymn of the church that for centuries have thrilled the hungry hearts of devout men and women and have served as stairways by which they have climbed into the presence of God, leave them dull and listless and uninterested. The man who has lost all appetite for his daily bread is to be pitied. But how infinitely greater is the tragedy when we lose all desires for the bread of life. It is by no means difficult to find those who have so long and so persistently fed upon the leeks and garlics of Egypt that they seem to have lost all taste for the heavenly manna. I know that was a long quote, and I hope you are Keaton, if you're one that can read stuff better. But he talks about the challenge that a lot of people have lost their appetite for our daily bread. We've lost our appetite for the bread of life. We don't hunger and thirst for it, maybe like we once did, or maybe we've never did. And he kind of compares that to when the people of Israel got out of Egypt. They were out of slavery and they were being fed by God. They were connected with God in a way they never had been. But they start getting into the wilderness, and all of a sudden they reach a point where there's like, man, wouldn't it be great just to go back to Egypt and have our fill of the leeks and garlic and all the food that Egypt had? Man, wouldn't that be better than the manna? And it's kind of like, it's meant to just draw a reaction from us. Why in the world they were going to this promised land? Why would they give up being directly fed from God to go back to being slaves in Egypt? They have the appetite for the wrong thing. Same boat that a lot of us struggle with on a daily basis. We have the appetite for the wrong thing. We're trying to go to this promised land that of heaven that has been, being prepared for us by Jesus. And along the way, sometimes we hunger it for the wrong things. We want to go back to this land of sin that we were in, this slavery that we were experiencing to sin. To feast on those things that will never satisfy us. And so the man who hungers and thirsts for God wants to eat that manna. They want to eat the meat that he is providing because it means they're in that relationship with him, going where he wants them to go to reach the promises that he has promised. And that's the same thing that this beatitude is challenging for us today. If we hunger and thirst for the promises of God, if we hunger and thirst for righteousness, we are going to be blessed. We're going to be blessed because we are going to be satisfied. And we're going to be talking about that just a second. Um, and hey, let's take a moment to know that I just clicked on the right way, apparently, to go to the next screen. But blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. And this word satisfied is a strong word. It's a graphic word. Yet it's originally applied to the feeding of animals or to fattening them up in a stall. Those of you who have cows, it's kind of putting one in the bin before you got them all, you're about to sell them. And so you get them in the corral and you feed them grain and you feed them the good stuff for a few days to make sure they're really fattened up before you do. It's also used in the Bible when we talk about the multitudes fed of the loaves and fishes. There was only so much, but then everybody was able to eat. And there was so much that was still left over because everybody was satisfied. Everybody was filled. Um, and that's what blessing that we're going to have. If we hunger and thirst, we are going to be completely satisfied. We're not going to want anything else. We're going to be filled to the brim, and so much so we should be filled so much that we're overflowing, and want to share that with others, how great it is, how God has satisfied us. We need to be a group of people who the rest of the world looks at as different because we are satisfied. Even regardless of what situations that we are faced with, we are content. We're satisfied. We've been filled not just in a sense of like, hey, we're content in all situations, which, I think we do get to, but in content, we're not searching for something else, because we found it. We found God. And he has declared us righteous. So the most important thing that we can have is a relationship with God. And hey, we found it. We found it through Jesus. He has declared us righteousness. He declared us righteous in the forgiveness we have through him. And now we're trying to live in the way that we can continually walk with God in that righteousness. And it's satisfying, it's filling. The prodigal son is a great story to go to when I think about this. When he was hungry, he wanted to eat on the husk that he was giving these pigs that he was assigned to feed. Beforehand, he had money. He was filling himself with all the foods of this world. And then when he ran out of that, he was willing to eat even what these animals are eating, this slop. But when he became fully aware of this state of starvation that he was in, of this, like, man, I'm starving. What am I doing? When he becomes aware of that starvation, he turns to the Father, to a relationship where all his needs are met, where he was welcomed with open and loving arms. To the hunger and thirst, it means just this. We might feed upon the husk of this world. We might be starving and just willing to eat whatever we can. But when we become fully aware of the state of our spiritual being, when we become aware of that we are filled with sin, that we are separated with God, that our spiritual state is like that, then nothing is going to satisfy us like going back to the Father. I thought Padfield does such a beautiful way of connecting those lessons, and Lloyd Jones had this. It was the same. They both mentioned this. I thought that was such a neat thing to make that connection there of the prodigal son. That's us. We feel ourselves on the things of this world, but when we finally go back to the Father, we're satisfied. We no longer are, like Israel wanting to go back to the land of slavery. We're content with what the Father's going to give us. And so it is only God who can fill a soul. And he will certainly fill those with grace who sense their own emptiness. Sean's did such a great job of building up, to this point of, we kind of recognize, looking at the kind of people that are going to be blessed, it's the kind of people who recognize their spiritual state and recognize they need God. And this one is like, hey, there's a recognition there of, I need God. And now there's like a desire that he's going to fulfill it, that he is going to satisfy them. And so I love this part here. It says, the happiness of heaven will certainly fill the soul. The righteousness now shall be complete. Heaven will be God and his image, both in their full perfection. I thought that was a great thing to think about, and diving into that, heaven will be God and his image, us. We are God's image. We've been created in his image. And when we are in heaven together, that's going to be the full perfection. And so, when happiness of heaven, it certainly is going to fill our soul. We're going to be satisfied when we get there, and our righteousness is going to be complete. We're going to be with God together. That's the ultimate perfection that we're going to have. But we can have that in this life as far as having a satisfaction with God, being satisfied in our state of sin, that we've now been declared righteousness. We've now have this justification that God provides. And so he's wanting a people that hunger and thirst for that hunger and thirst for a relationship with him, that hunger and thirst for an eternity with him. And I need to do a better job of not trying to feed on the things of this world. And the Jews of that day needed to recognize that as well. All right, here we go. Back to back to how we were doing this. Let me circle back through here. All right, there it goes. Now it's coming back. All right, so takeaway. Are you hungry? The people who come to Christ in penitent faith realize they don't have what it takes before God. That's kind of our big takeaway from this. Christ people hunger and thirst for righteousness, because while we know that we are forgiven and accepted before God on the basis of all that Christ is, and all that he has done, we also know how far away we are from all that Christ calls us to be. Think about that. I kind of slowed down while reading it, but I thought it was a really great quote that I think Lloyd Jones had put in his study. Christ people hunger and thirst for righteousness because while we know that we are forgiven and accepted before God on the basis of all that Christ is and all that he has done, we also know how far we are from all that Christ calls us to be. I want to challenge you with thinking, challenge me. Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you craving the relationship with Christ? Are you craving and hungering and starving for what He has called us to be, so that you can be right with Him? I hope that you are. And I hope that we can find a way to encourage other people to be the same. I hope that starts with prayer for a change of their heart. And we're going to be talking about that in this next lesson. But I hope something spoke out to you in this lesson. I hope it not only did you learn something, I hope you were moved to think about your relationship some. And I hope there's something that you have found in your own personal study that you want to bring into discussion via Zoom at 6:30 on Wednesdays. There's no way I could do justice in covering this. Not just from the time frame, but I'm just not smart enough, wise enough to cover everything that you can know about this verse in 30 minutes. Or less. But it was, I enjoyed studying this. I enjoyed it waking up my need to hunger and thirst more for God in the way that I should. And maybe it woke you up to that desire as well. So I thank you for joining us. I hope you join us via Zoom.